Welcome to the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we have the pleasure of the company of Mr. Victor Ovalles-Santos. Welcome to the Global Roundtable, Mr. Ovalles-Santos. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Natasha, indeed.
So Victor is a good friend because we have met him at the United Nations often. He's very active in the area of economic governance and financing and development. As a matter of fact, he is G77 coordinator for economic governance and financing for development. So I think we'd like to start this conversation, which will be focused mostly on financing on development, by asking you, what is actually financing for development? And why is it important?
Thank you very much indeed. I would say that the first word that comes to my mind is solidarity and the certainty that larger collaboration and joint effort among all nations is what brings the larger and more sustainable growth and prosperity for mankind. So essentially, I think the spirit of Monterey, it's a spirit of inclusiveness, a spirit of sharing knowledge and opportunity, and a spirit of trying to defeat the larger challenges of mankind in terms of eradication of poverty, of hunger, of inequality, and for that use the tools we have, the tools that we have developed along the time, use the tools of science, of technology, and the goodwill of nations indeed.
Thank you, and let's talk about these tools and what is needed for those tools, right? Financing implies financial resources. It implies money that has to come from developed countries to developing countries. So what has been the experience up till now? What have been responses of developed nations to developing nations? And what is the situation right now?
I will have to say also that the Monterey Conference included a very important chapter, which is a systemic chapter, that speak about common goals that we have in international arena. What is to say, have proper regulation, proper rules, clear for trade, for debt mechanisms, and so on. So I would say first that it not only provide a field for financing, for what is to say cash transfers or what is known as ODA, official development assistance, but also is a larger platform. As you may know, trade has been a fundamental tool for developing nations to attain development since the 1960s, and UNCTAD was a very good example of that. Developing nations have made substantial progress through accessing to better tools for developed nationally, with the advantages that exporting could be commodities or with more added value products, of course increasingly along the time, as we've seen the examples of India, China, Brazil, and particularly the BRICS, the emerging nations. But I would say that in the discussion, of course, ODA plays a very important part. ODA, I would have to go back to very important...
Sorry to interrupt you, but for our audiences, so let's clarify, official development assistance, right?
Yeah, indeed. Official development assistance is
ODA.
and ODA would be the acronym. You would find out that in the UN we have
Right.
many dozens, even maybe hundreds of acronyms that, of course, we exchange a lot among colleagues and diplomats and delegates here in the UN. So ODA indeed is a very important part of Monterey. It's very important for developing nations, particularly for Africa. Sometimes, and in particular countries of Africa, it counts up to a very important amount of the national revenues. And also it's a tool for mobilizing on other resources nationally, domestically. You know, sometimes the issue of development is, where do you get that financial resources available to make a fundamental step forward in terms of your economic model, in terms of your industrial capacity. So sometimes that financial assistance, it could be a seed and it could have a multiplier effect a long time. So of course in that, cooperation is tremendously important, not only from the financial point of view, but also from the technical cooperation and the technology transfer indeed. So then trying to go back to your question, it was included all elements indeed inside. But I would say that discussions in these issues have been challenging at some point. There is an ongoing financial crisis globally that has posed important constraints on developing nations. We see a lot of what is to say, adjustments in fiscal policy, We see tightened national budgets, and of course that has an impact in ODA. We could say that the highest point in recent years happened on the Doha Conference for Financing for Development in 2008. And immediately after the conference, the 6 months after the conference, that we had a peak. And of course, it has been under pressure, and it has been under debate, the usefulness, the importance, and if we should move into new and different mechanisms for finance development.
But it's interesting to note that 2008 was precisely the year of the Great Crisis, and you said it was the peak of ODA. So is that a good sign? Does this give us hope and faith that it can be a good sign for the world community?
Well, I would say that it was more attached to the fact that the Doha Conference was able to bring together a very large, amount of political leaders that brought together political will. And as a result of that, ODA, continuing a trend of uprising. But definitely what has impacted it more dramatically, the current trend, which is negative, it is the financial crisis. And this financial crisis has created tremendous stress over developing nations and also developed countries. So we would like to say that it has posed a common challenge for all, and that needs the work of all to be overcome. We had important, step forwards and ideas coming out of the 2009 conference on the financial crisis and its impact on development, an initiative of the, in that time, President of the General Assembly, Father Miguel de Escoto. And the G77 has continued advocating for that. Of course, we're looking in a constructive way. We look channels for dialogue. And as I say, solidarity, common work, common principles is fundamental. But of course, in the discussion of the principles, many times are divergence in the views.
Right.
And that, of course, it's a matter that we are really waiting for the upcoming scenarios to keep building up political.
You mentioned Doha. Before Doha, there was Monterey in 2002.
Correct.
I had the pleasure of being there, and I can remember the excitement at Monterey and the hopes, and the world was really hopeful for changes. 0.7% was discussed so often, and it was brought into the forefront of international debate, which is the agreement, the international agreement of the countries to give 0.7% of GPA to developing countries. What would you say, what is the biggest achievement of the Monterey Consensus?
Well, in this, there are different views and perspectives, so I will try to summarize some of them. In one hand, many said that the idea of having in front decision makers at the highest level and also representative of the international financial institutions plus the academia and civil society in a very innovative way was definitely a contribution of Monterey. What is to say, a discussion at different levels, from the policy discussion to the very, very practical and small detail implementation in the farthest place in Africa or in Latin America. So I think that that's an added value, that wide and overarching discussion.
So you would say it was a historical moment when this question was brought to the highest political level?
We would have to say that probably since 1960s, 1970s, since UNCTAD I and the new international economic order, there was not such a debate on economic governance, on financial issues in the United Nations. So indeed, Monterey process was fundamental. They were tremendously effortless or full of effort negotiators involved, very distinguished ambassadors, delegates, diplomats, civil society academics. I had the honor to meet with many of them. I've learned from many of them. And indeed, I believe Monterey was a historic opportunity. And Doha continued building up on that idea. But it was not only the ODA. The ODA was a fundamental issue, an expression of that solidarity. But I would have to say that the systemic chapter, systemic discussion, the overall view involving trade, involving debt, involving the set of rules that are necessary to, make possible, which are the correct conditions that are necessary to make it happen. It's like, it is not only a question about money. It's a question of a systemic approach. It's a question of a large list of issues. But I believe that Monterey, Doha, and the follow-up to financing for development has many more other opportunities to bring fruits. And I see with hope and with certainty the ongoing discussions and very close discussions in the next General Assembly on how to better implement its follow-up.
So you work within G77 very actively, and you talked about different tools and a systemic approach. From your experience working with developing nations, what would you say successful tools have been? What are some good practices and success stories that have happened? So we can not only complain about the lack of financial assistance, but also say, well, yes, on a systemic level, changes have happened. On the approaches, changes have happened. And tell me what else.
Well, I think it would take us probably quite some days, to go through the whole amount of development cooperation projects that are ongoing. I would say that if I just simply take an example, and I think in a UN agency which is involved on development cooperation, I will have to mention the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. I will have to bear in mind that it's an organization that probably mobilized, or it's related to the mobilization of $24 billion per year, which from the $130 billion that are annually allocated to ODA, I would say it's a significant amount. So I think UNDP is a good example. And UNDP, of course, has more than 100 country offices on each nation. They work according to national programs. They collaborate closely with national governments. They follow national legislation and national priorities, because I think that's the key point. When you find a partnership, the partnership has to involve both sides' view. What is to say, the more effective, the more efficient investment that creates capacity and contribute to development is the one that is aware of the national particularities and the national reality that is working with. So I think the UN has done a very good job in that regard, in particularly UNDP, through the regional bureaus, and also in New York in the executive board of UNDP. So I think that would be one of the best examples. And it goes from projects on water management, crops, education, financing for education probably is a fundamental area. Of course, UNESCO is very involved in that, but we have contributed from New York and several documents, ministerial declarations and so on to that effort. And of course, you could also step into the idea of financing for social development. What is to say, not only look into growth or into employment or macroeconomic indicators, and also look at the social dimension, the human dimension, and then you get into human development. And I think that that's probably the approach which is more interesting, an approach that takes into account that we are speaking about lives of people in the developing world ahead. And we are thinking about billions of persons that have to struggle to live, with maybe $2 a day. And just simply to try to imagine that situation, that you have to walk several miles to get water or to have the proper sanitation,
So technical assistance has been very helpful.
Indeed.
And often not very costly, right?
I would say that the sharing of knowledge is a fundamental tool. Knowledge can enlighten someone else, or it can probably give a guidance of what has been more efficient. And we're constantly knowing from the experience of the other. I think that that's something you find a lot in South-South cooperation. The cooperation within the South not necessarily is based on financial contributions.
And it's growing. It's South-South cooperation.
It's based on solidarity, I would say. But of course, the discussion has to be separated because one of the issues that G77 advocates more strongly is the idea that in the process of development, developed nations had the opportunity to do it through a massive accumulation of capital and also of natural resources coming from developing nations. So there was a very important footprint, or I would say ecological footprint for that development that nowadays countries, you could see in OECD had achieved. But when you see the opportunity for developing countries, you see that there has been more scarcity in terms of availability of financial resources, of capital, to foster that development. That's why common but different responsibilities has a place in this discussion, and that's why different speeds have to apply, because even some nations are emerging, and we're very happy and proud of it, because it's an example that different ways and different models to achieve development are possible and are good. Diversity can coexist, and diversity is good. But at the same time, we cannot forget that there are very important, I would say, challenges in terms of millions or hundreds of millions of people still fighting with poverty in those nations. So then we cannot assume that a nation that has probably come up from extreme poverty or from low-income country to low income to be a middle-income nation, it is ready to be a top donor, or it is ready to collaborate in a development cooperation scenario under the same principles. I think that that idea, of course, is one that if I had here colleagues of mine from developed nations, they would strongly argue with me and try to convince me, but I think it's one of the things G77 has been keen. We would definitely like to say we have achieved the final state of development and we have everything that we need to guarantee to our people everything in the better possible conditions.
Now that you mentioned that some donor countries have actually passed, some recipient countries have actually passed to be donor countries. So there are examples like that in international development.
I would say that it's not a conclusive. We could not automatically say, maybe the example of South Korea, which is a nation that had a very, very fast process of development. It was a member of G77. It's not a member of G77 anymore. Everyone is aware of the strength of the growth in Korea. But I would say that there are very few examples. I would have problems to even start making a list beyond this example. But it's an ongoing discussion. I think the important thing is that we all acknowledge that the UN is a proper forum for having this discussion, that it's the larger, more inclusive international organization for having this discussion where small and large are represented, and particularly in issues that affect development and the needs of the poorest. I think the role of United Nations is unquestioned, and its contribution too.
Let me ask you about the ODA. How many countries are actually fulfilling the 0.7%? What's the situation currently?
I would say that instead of making a list, because lists are always exclusive, you mention some, you exclude others, they're making an effort. I would have to acknowledge that, for example, Nordic countries have fulfilled the target.
For a long time.
Yeah, indeed.
It's been a tradition almost.
Indeed. It's I think a very good way of combining a very competitive economic system and also that is not incompatible with solidarity, and a social responsibility. That then, of course, you would have European nations, which I would say from the information actually the OECD and the European Commission publish are, I would say between 0.4, 0.5. Of course, the current situation in Europe, I know that it has been putting a lot of pressure there, but still there are examples of solidarity, and that has had commitment have stayed, because also contributes to the overall health of the international financial system and its governance. And then, of course, the very probably polemic discussion is with the touch base on U.S. Indeed is the largest donor, but at the same time the figure related to its its gross
It's a low
national product
percentage.
is low. I think it would be something around the 0.2 and 0.3. But I think the importance here is that all nations are doing something, and that we can do more, and that together we can do more. And I think the G77, whenever we present these ideas and proposals, what we're looking at the end of the day is going beyond the divide and build this bridges of dialogue, buildings of trust, and from the United Nations contribute to a better world, more prosperous for all.
Thank you, Victor. And I would like to introduce Margaret Hayward, who is here with us today as well. Margaret is our manager for outreach, communications, and our liaison with the United Nations. So you mentioned the current financial situation and the structure and the governance, and I think Margaret has a few questions in that area.
Well, actually, yes, I wanted to ask you, touch on reform. Actually, especially the international economic system has become a huge global casino, and 4 trillion worth of transactions are made within a click of a mouse without being regulated properly. So with this irresponsible way of operating the international financial system, are there any ideas being presented within the UN framework, and how are they going to be implemented?
Indeed, this is actually an excellent question, Margaret. Thank you for it. We would have to go back to 2009 and acknowledge that United Nations had a conference at the highest level on the financial crisis. Recommendations from the conference has been implemented by United Nations, and they have gone even beyond to many forums and has been incorporated to national policies and plans. I would have to say that indeed the financial economy, or the financialization of the economy, the casino, so-called casino economy, collapsed in 2008. And indeed that way of creating wealth, if it could be called that way, shown that it was unsustainable long term. I think it was probably the strongest call to focus back on the real economy, on the size where probably the real wealth can be created. And also a wealth that is related to job creation, that is created to prosperity in the long term. Financialization of the economy has brought, and of course it would be a topic we could speak largely, has brought indeed a lot of distortions and imbalances in the global economic and financial system and its governance and architecture. I think there's common will, and there's common agreement among all countries that more regulation, better regulation is necessary and it's needed, and many policies has been implemented in that regard. Of course, the discussion is who pays the bill. So far, citizens have been paying the bill. So far, social policies and program has been paying the bill for mismanagement on the financial sector. Of course, I would be blind, or it would be not true to blame a whole sector of the economy for that. Financial sector has a role to provide the liquidity, to dynamize the economy, and of course working closely in a private-public partnership for creating wealth and well-being for the citizens. So I think it was a problem of certain elements misregulated, and probably, and of course this is a large discussion, and I'm trying to incorporate many views within not just simply single out one, there was an abuse of certain rules and certain opportunities. But this discussion indeed can go along for a long time. Actually, we are looking forward to foster in the United Nations a common platform for a better global economic governance that incorporates views from developing nations, and in a way which is consistent with the acknowledgement of the reality and the systemic importance of certain economies. So I think at the end of the day, lack of regulation, casino economy is good for no economy, because it's a short-term gain, created a lot of instability, And when it clashes, when it collapses, definitely collapse, then it's people pay the bill. So, and with a lot of misery, unfortunately. We see a lot of social cuts and social spending, and in a way, the end of a model that was associated with bringing prosperity. So I think it is not a blame game. I think trust is necessary for the system to work. But for that, I think the proper regulation, it's necessary to be put in place. And of course, here we could start speaking about better cooperation among central bankers, financial institutions. There is a large discussion about which is the role of Basel Committee, a large discussion about how much and how far the international financial institutions based in Washington, the Bretton Woods institutions, are responsible or not, or to which extent for the financial crisis to occur. There is a common agreement among experts that there were not sufficiently and timely advices that the collapse would happen, and that was a stronger critic that was given to those institutions, and would trigger an important process of reform that has been followed up very closely from G77 perspective. The main message there has been that larger voice and participation for developing nations is necessary, because there is indeed an increasing role, for example, of the BRICS and of the developing nations as a whole on the international economic and financial system and its governance. So the current structures is the view that do not reflect fully what is to say the change in how the the global economy has evolved. But of course there is a discussion, it's ongoing. It has been praised by some and criticized by others. Praised because probably has been a movement on 3, 4, 5% of the shares. And of course it's a small portion. There's a lot to work ahead, but it's small progress. This is being criticized by others in G77 because that reform has been done sometimes at the expense of developing nations. There are more than 20 developing nations that in the last quota reform of 2010 were affected by such reform, and they lost share. And that's probably the complexity of the issue. But indeed, I think there is no doubt about the relevance of global economic governance discussions, the most inclusive as possible. And the UN offers the opportunity of a rule-based, universal organization that is well placed to contribute to discussion, including in all the fora. My view is that we are in a position to make progress and walk into a new step of better regulation, better policies, more collaboration, if we are able to find commonalities and basic principles that would allow us to tackle this crisis, which is affecting all, and to avoid an instability that it would be of great threat, not only to but to developing nations, and particularly to the quality of life of people, because that's at the end. We have to understand those policy discussions about regulation, reform, voice representation has an impact on the daily life of individuals, on the fact
they are the end users of the
mortgage,
policies.
the interest rate we pay for money, and then if the money is more expensive and if there are budget cuts, there's less money for education, less money for innovation, less money for science and technology, and that's the future. The future is the regeneration we built, is the young people, young adults that are going, there are the future generations, and of course, the global economy and the global economic model is changing fast. So at the end, I think the call is simple. There are simple ideas. More of my finance into education, more finance into science and technology, which will bring more prosperity for all, and that prosperity will be, shared globally.
Thank you, Victor, so much. And just briefly, before we close, let's just address another collapse. You talked about the collapse of financial institutions and financial regulations and systems. We're also facing another collapse, which is the collapse of our environment. And that has also affected financing for development. The conference in Copenhagen has talked about additional $100 billion needed for developing nations to face that. So what is the situation now? How has the ecological situation affected the economic development and financing for development?
I think the discussion is just starting. It would be preempting discussions we're going to have in the UN to try to express a conclusion ahead. But definitely on the issue of how to finance the, the economic model with a more sustainable dimension, as of course is related to discussions you were pointing out in climate change and in post-Rio. I would have to say, focusing only on the financial dimension, that definitely the financial allocation of resources has to come from existing sources, innovative mechanisms, as has been discussed in the framework of Doha and Monterey. And within those innovative mechanisms, we would have to look at, for example, taxation, this financial taxation, this financial tax. And then probably we're getting then in a discussion which is more consensual. Because when you speak about the Green Fund, well, many will say that it's quite empty. And then many will say that going that direction will bring challenges because it will bring the question where the money is coming from. So many will say that that money can come better from trade, from existing ODA commitments, but particularly that more than trying to find more resources in an environment of scarcity, we should try to focus on transfer of finance, transfer of technology, and in the creation of developing nations of that technology. Because the whole idea of financing, of transferring liquidity that goes from south to north as in the sale of commodities, coming back in terms of cooperation, international cooperation, the whole idea is to contribute to that development model in the south. But maybe it's not only about money. Maybe the role of science and technology, it's even more important, and it's going to be more even important in the future.
So let's say more transfer of software than hardware.
I would say that's the point. I would say that definitely existing commitments has to continue, has to be implemented, has to be fulfilled, attached to the discussion we had before, but probably in the direction and in the possibility of building up a new partnership. The role of science and technology can be the bridge, because collaboration between North and South in this dimension will bring long-term prosperity. It would not only be a matter of transferring cash and money, like assistance, the old way fashion to contribute, but it would be a partnership that can evolve, that can create wealth in the South, wealth in the North, can be seen as a way of cooperation, better solidarity, but also in interest.
And it has a great multiplier effect as well.
Indeed. So I think in the future, if we continue to face this ongoing scenario of crisis and of scarcity, definitely without the commitment to continue working together, because at the end of the day, the ODA is a very small expression of one thing, that there is a goodwill and that we want to work together in solidarity, and that we care about each other's problems, and that is an expression. And then that builds really the platform for discussing about the real issues, which is a platform for trade, which is the discussion regarding technology.
Thank you, Victor. On this very positive note, we are going to close the conversation with you, and thank you so much for coming over here. We hope to continue working with you on the issues that are of interest to you, to us, and the whole world, I believe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Natasha, and I hope that this short dialogue has served to what dialogue in its original idea means, which is to create knowledge.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Victor. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you indeed.
Thank you for watching the Global Roundtable. Today we had the pleasure of the company of Mr. Victor Ovalles-Santos, who is the coordinator for G77 in the area of finance, development and global governance.